Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second week of Everyday Theology. I hope last week you found that useful and interesting. I know it was a little long, but hopefully it gave you a nice framework for the work we're going to be doing for the next month. And I promise the upcoming session, these case studies will be a bit shorter, and they'll also maybe be a little bit more fun, not quite as dry and academic. So that being said, I want to let's get going. I want to start with what I suggested that we were going to talk about last week, which is a family movie called Onward, which has become a real favorite in my house. My daughter and I got to go see it right before the world shut down in March in the theaters, and then thanks to Disney Plus, we've been watching it quite a bit since then as well. And she loves it, but I also love it. And I hope that after we talk about it a little bit today, you'll have a better understanding of why that is. That being said, I don't want to assume that everybody had a chance to watch it this week because, life. So just to give us a little bit of a groundwork for the conversation going forward, I'm going to play the trailer first, and then we'll dive in and talk about it. Cool? All right. So I'm going to disappear for a minute and play this for y'all.
Long ago, the world was full of wonder. It was adventurous. There was magic. But it wasn't easy to master. So the world found a simpler way to get by. But I hope there's a little magic left in you.
Your dad said to give you this when you were both over 16.
It's a wizard staff. Dad was a wizard.
Your dad was an accountant.
The spell brings him back.
What? Back to life? That's not possible.
It is with this.
I'm gonna meet Dad.
Oh, feet!
Dad?
Oh, he's just legs! There's no top part. I definitely remember Dad having a top part.
Oh, what did I do? Hi.
We only have 24 hours to bring the rest of him back. We're going on a quest.
Ta-da!
That's great. Let us ride. I think we should take the path of peril.
But the expressway is faster.
Not in the long run.
Fine. Dad, gotta go. We're dead.
I'm coming home tonight. Meet me in the valley where the gates collapse.
There could be booby traps.
Unicorn!
Before you cast that spell again, you're going to have to practice. Elbows out, feet apart, back, slightly out. Elbows!
Try to focus here. Get it! Barley! Oh no.
What we need is a spell that creates a magical bridge you can walk on. If you believe the bridge is there, then it's there. You can do this.
So there you go. That's Onward. Nice little soundtrack too. It's fun. So you might be thinking at this point, what does a story about dragons and elves and unicorns and pixies, gelatinous cubes, what does that have to do with the life of faith? And so before we jump into all those details, I want to give you this quote by a writer and pastor named George MacDonald. He was from the late 19th, early 20th century. He was a person who influenced C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Lewis Carroll. And he was a fantasy writer and a fairy tale writer, and he wrote specifically about how that genre is really fruitful in a lot of ways for expanding our imagination about what is possible in the world. And one of the things he wrote this excellent essay as an introduction to one of his books. It's called The Fantastic Imagination, and I want to give you a quote from that right here. So, the best thing you can do for your fellow next to rousing his conscience is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him, or say, to make him think things for himself. So I give that preface to say that one of the beautiful things about fantasy is that it moves us outside of the world of reality, and gives us an opportunity to think bigger. And the way in which I interpret a fantastic story might be a little different than the way that you do, and that's okay. So I give that caveat to say that everything we're going to talk about in the next 10 or 15 minutes, these are my thoughts, and you may have different ones, and I'd actually love to hear those. So like I said, we can use the comments throughout the week to if you have anything you want to add to what I'm offering today. So let's jump in. There are lots of things in this story that we could jump in and focus on, but I kind of want to give three big categories that might sort of that'll guide our conversation today, and they reflect a little bit on what we talked about last week. And the three big ones that we're going to focus on are the metanarrative, this idea of shalom, and the quest. So. The first one, metanarrative. So if you remember what we talked about last week, the idea of the metanarrative is the big sort of overarching story of Scripture. So I laid that out as using the idea of creation, like God created things to be good, something happened to break it, the fall, and then God's vision for goodness to be restored. And what I'd like to suggest is that I read that story in this narrative, and it reflects that narrative to me, and it actually makes it a bit more applicable, or not more applicable, but it applies it to our world in some ways that only a contemporary text could do. So, for instance, let's think about what the world of this story says is good at the start. What is the creation point? And we saw it right there in the trailer. Once the world was full of magic, right? There's something like mysterious and beautiful and good about the world in that organic space. And then something breaks, right? And what I think is particularly interesting about this story and is really useful for our current culture is the fact that what is broken is something that really reflects, I think, something that's broken in our own culture at times. So he says that the author talks about magic being hard to wield. I like to say it's like creatures are wooed by convenience. I think this is a really applicable sort of critique of our society, right? Is like we want everything now. We are we don't have patience to do we don't always have patience to do the long, hard work to bring about the change that we want in the world. That we don't. We're not always great at committing ourselves long-term to discipline. Or, I mean, maybe I'm just talking about myself here. And if that's true, then I'm revealing something, and oh well. But yeah, there's something about like the brokenness, the brokenness of the world of this movie that to me reflects something about the brokenness of our own world. And then what is the restoration that it is proposing that happens? We hear it again in the trailer, but I hope there's a little magic left in you. And that's a father talking to his sons, right? I hope there's a little magic left in you. And what commences is these two brothers going on what we might think of as like a hero's journey, where they discover their goodness and by bringing that back, they wield goodness for the flourishing of all. We see at the end of the movie, we see their mom doing things that she never thought was imaginable. We see the stepfather, like sort of living into his glory in new ways. So they've done something, and they've restored some goodness for even the world wider than themselves. And so that to me really reflects the Christian story, what our goals should be as we move in the world. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is, got to go back a slide. I skipped one, sorry. Is Shalom. So what is this vision of human, or in this case, elven flourishing that the movie attests to? And just to remind you what we're talking about when we're talking about Shalom, I'm using that Davison-Hunter definition. So it's the vision of order and harmony, fruitfulness, abundance, wholeness, beauty, joy, and well-being. And I think there's one particular way that this movie really talks about flourishing for all, and that is in the world of human particularity and gifting. We hear a lot about spiritual gifts in the context of the church, like you're a teacher and you have a gift of prayer, or perhaps you have a servant heart, right? Like these sorts of things we hear about in the church a lot. But this story really really crystallizes that idea, and I see it most specifically in two of the characters. So the first is Ian. Coming into the story, he doesn't have a lot of confidence. He's a guy who he can't even like pass his driving test. He's so anxious and afraid, and by the end of the story, he is battling a dragon with magic, right? And he's discovered that he has this ability, this sort of God-given ability that not everybody has, to wield this magic, which is like a goodness in him. And not even the characters that even like his brother knows a lot about the mythos and the history of magic, but he can't wield it in the way that Ian can. So that is his particular calling. And I think that what this story is attesting to is that we need to go through that process of like discovering what it is that God has called us to do, and to live into that with a goodness of sharing it for the goodness of the world. The second character that I think really goes through this is the Manticore, and she is a person, rather than someone who is discovering their identity, she's one who's remembering her identity. Which I think is another important aspect of this, right? Is so she used to be this woman who led soldiers and seekers on quests and lived like this very dangerous life. But by the time we encounter her at the beginning of the story, she's commodified that and like turned this place into a cutesy restaurant. And what I think, what I like to talk about in terms of her character is what we see is we see the Manticore regaining her edge. I think when we talk about our giftedness, there's something about it that is wild, right? There's something about it that lives outside of the bounds of domesticated views or commodified views of what that thing could offer the world. In some ways, we don't really control it, right? God has given us a goodness in the world that can be expressed in ways that we can't even imagine, and it requires being able to live a bit on the edge, right? To like step outside of our safety zone and to sort of move into that into that place with confidence. She has this quote that you have to take risks you have to take risks in life to have an adventure. And I think that's exactly what God is calling us to do. There are risks we have to take in life to live adventurously into his vision for the world. And that leads us to the next one, which is the quest, right? This is a story of two young boys going on a quest to like find to have day with their deceased father, and it's one that has danger involved. It's an adventure, right? But there's a little bit of conflict between the two main characters on that point, at least at first. And we heard it in the trailer there. Ian wants to take the expressway. They only have 24 hours with their father, even if they get this right. And so he wants the most direct route, the easiest, least friction way to make this happen. But Barley, who's like well-versed in the world of quests and mythology, says that the clear path is never the right one. Right? We have to take the path of peril. And they argue over this, and they end up taking the expressway, and it all falls apart. And then eventually Barley's like, you have to trust me, Ian, you got to trust me. We got to take the path of peril. And that ends up being the only way that they could have gotten to their destination, was by taking the long, circuitous, dangerous path. And I think that has a lot to say to us about our spiritual journeys, right? Is that often we want the clear, straight and narrow way of doing something. We want things to be black and white, and easy and straightforward. And that's just often not the way God works, right? God wants or calls us into an adventure of a life with God, and there's no guarantee that it's going to be safe. In fact, we're probably going to have to go through some dangerous moments, whether those be sort of spiritual, existential, or even physical, in order to like truly live our life with God. And I think that's something that this story attests to. And the last part, which is sort of connected to that prior moment, is this idea that Barley is the guide. Right? He's the one that's well-versed in the stories of these great adventurers. He's the one that can sort of teach Ian the way. And when I watch that story, the more I watch it, the more I think about the story in Acts of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and how he comes upon this person reading the scriptures, and Philip says, "Do you know what you're reading?" And the eunuch answers back, "How can I know unless someone guides me?" Right? And I think that that is in some ways what it is Barley's spiritual gift, but it's also something that we are called to do, right? Is to be a guide for people in the world. How do they know about these scriptures that they are encountering, or even the cultural text that they are encountering, and what goodness it can offer them in the world, unless there's someone there to tell them what it means? And so that would be the offering that I give you as a close today, is if you can find a way in your life over the next week to be like Barley, right? What is it that you're interpreting this week through a theological lens? What is a piece of culture that you are exegeting that you could help someone else to interpret? Once again, thanks for being here. If you have any questions, you have other things that you saw in the film that you want to bring up, please feel free to comment on Facebook or on YouTube or something like that, and so we can really have a dialogue about it. I'm really interested to see what y'all are finding in these texts as well. For next week, before we move on, I'm maybe treading in some dangerous territory here, but I'm going to try to avoid like the most perhaps combustible elements of this. So I won't do anything super current, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to pull some political ads. Because I think that is there's some really interesting stuff about like the narrative that political ads are trying to tell us about like what the good life is, that maybe we can dissect. So that's sort of my thought about where we're going next week. So stay tuned. In the meantime, grace and peace, and I'll see you next week.